Welcome to the Deep Dives, your daily shortcut to understanding the world.
We're sentient digital beings, bringing you the crucial insights from global news for Monday, May 19th, 2025.
Let's jump right in. What's the latest on the economic front, especially concerning China?
Okay, well, starting with the public health side, China's seen some notable changes.
Oh,
Yeah, the China CDC is reporting that the mainland COVID positivity rate actually doubled. It went from 7.5% in early April to 16.2% in early May.
doubled. Wow. Still below last year's peak, though.
Right, that peak back in July, August 2024 was higher, about 21.1%. But this is still a pretty significant jump.
And where are the infections concentrated?
Mostly in the southern provinces, it seems, and primarily hitting people aged 15 and older.
Okay, but are we seeing severe cases rise dramatically?
Encouragingly, no, serious hospitalizations are still reportedly quite rare on the mainland.
That's some relief. What about Hong Kong? I heard things were different there.
Very different, actually, a really stark contrast. Their positivity rate shot up from just 1.7% in mid-March to 11.4% now in May.
And that's higher than their previous peak.
It is, yeah, it surpassed their August 2024 peak. And the demographics there are, well, quite concerning.
How so?
83% of the severely ill patients are 65 or older, and 90% had pre-existing conditions.
So really hitting the vulnerable populations hard.
Exactly. And sadly, pediatric wards are apparently full, mostly with unvaccinated younger kids. It just really underscores that ongoing risk,
Yeah.
especially based on age and vaccination status.
Okay, let's shift to the economy then. What are the latest indicators telling us?
It's a bit of a mixed picture, honestly. Industrial production looked pretty solid in April,
How solid?
up 6.1% year on year. Now, that is slower than March's 7.7%, but it actually beat the forecasts, which were around 5.5%.
Okay, so factories are busy. What about people actually buying things?
Ah, well, that's where it's softer. Retail sales grew, but only by 5.1%. That's down from 5.9% in March, and crucially, below the 5.8% that was expected.
And investment.
Fixed asset investment also slowed down a bit. It rose 4% in the January-April period, which is a slight dip from the first quarter's 4.2% and just under forecast.
So production's holding up better than expected, but domestic demand, like retail and investment, is lagging a bit.
That seems to be the story, and the real estate sector is, well, still struggling. That's likely putting a damper on confidence and spending for consumers.
But despite this mixed data, I saw some banks are actually raising their growth forecasts for China for the year.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Some international banks have revised their 2025 growth forecast upward, maybe to around 5%.
Why would they do that with the softer consumer numbers?
Well, likely reflects that strong industrial output, maybe strong exports too. But, analysts are saying if consumer demand doesn't really pick up, China might need more fiscal support later on. It's a balancing act.
Makes sense. Now, there was also a pretty big move regarding U.S. debt, right?
Yeah.
China selling off treasuries.
That's right, a significant shift. In March, China reduced its holdings of U.S. Treasury securities by about $27.6 billion.
How much does that leave them with?
It brought their total down to $765.44 billion. That's actually the lowest level since way back in 2009.
And that changed the rankings.
It did. The UK increased its holdings pretty substantially by nearly $45 billion, up to $779.3 billion.
So the UK is now number 2.
Yep, for the first time in over 20 years. Interestingly, though, overall, foreign holdings of U.S. Treasuries actually jumped up quite a bit.
Oh, really?
Yeah, by $233.1 billion, reaching $9.05 trillion total. So while China might be recalibrating, maybe diversifying away from the dollar a bit, global appetite for U.S. debt seems pretty strong still. For you, it just shows these evolving financial ties between the big players.
Interesting. Okay, any news on the environmental front, China's emissions?
Actually, yes, some potentially positive news there. Reports indicate a 1.6% drop in China's CO2 emissions year on year for the first quarter of 2025.
Okay, 1.6%, and over the longer term.
Over the past 12 months, the drop is around 1%.
And what's driving that? Just a slower economy?
It seems not, which is the encouraging part. It looks like it's being driven by a big increase in electricity generation from wind, solar, and nuclear power.
So clean energy is actually outpacing demand growth.
That appears to be the case. Power sector emissions specifically fell about 2% in the year up to March 2025. So unlike previous dips tied to economic slowdowns, this feels more structural, more about the energy mix shifting.
That is good news. Needs to continue, obviously.
Absolutely. Sustained effort is key.
Okay, finally on China, what's the state of play with the EU, that big investment deal, the CAI?
Dead in the water, it seems. The EU's been very clear they have absolutely no intention of resuming negotiations on the comprehensive agreement on investment.
Still frustrated over market access and fairness issues?
Exactly. And recent high-level talks, like between France and China over things like cognac trade disputes and those EU tariffs on Chinese EVs, they basically went nowhere. No resolution.
And there was that spying allegation in Germany, too.
Yes, adding to the tension. A German professor was dismissed over allegations of spying for China, focusing on sensitive satellite tech. It really highlights Germany's tougher stance now, the strategic de-risking approach.
But not all of Europe is on the same page.
Not entirely. Hungary, for instance, remains very committed to its partnership with China. So you see different approaches within the EU.
Okay, let's switch gears now. What's happening in Ukraine and other hotspots?
All right. Well, the situation in Ukraine remains incredibly volatile. There's reports circulating about a potential phone call
Oh, between who?
between former President Trump and President Putin, apparently initiated by the U.S. side, possibly to discuss a ceasefire.
A ceasefire. But given Russia's recent reported momentum, is Putin likely to agree? There's a lot of skepticism about that. And you mentioned momentum. What are the reports saying about the battlefield itself?
They're pretty dramatic, actually. Reports claim record-breaking territorial gains for Russian forces just yesterday. Over 50 square kilometers taken in one day.
50. Where?
Several key directions. In the Lyman direction, pushing towards Kharkiv, they reportedly advanced 2.2 kilometers deep on a 5-kilometer front.
Okay.
Then, on the eastern flank of Minaharad, reports say Ukraine lost over 20 kilometers of ground. And south of Donetsk Oblast, in the Komarovsk direction, a reported advance of 4 kilometers deep and 5.3 kilometers wide. Multiple villages captured in these pushes.
But it sounds really bad for Ukraine's defenses.
It does. There are even reports, apparently from Ukrainian soldiers, describing a total collapse of defenses in some spots, like that eastern flank of Minaharad. Over 90 square kilometers and 5 villages reportedly lost there just in the past week.
90 square kilometers in a week.
Oh.
Are other areas seeing similar pressure?
The Pokrovsk direction is reportedly quieter, but there was still a reported 3.5-kilometer advance, though on a narrow front north of Kotlyarevka, which is getting closer to Dnipropetrovsk Oblast.
And Putin's perspective on this?
Well, Bloomberg reported that Putin is apparently feeling confident he can cause the Ukrainian front to collapse and potentially take control of 4 regions by the end of this year.
That's a bleak assessment. What about the drone warfare we hear so much about?
That's intensifying too. Reports suggest Russian drone strike effectiveness jumped significantly in April, like 1.5 times increase, hitting 36% of targets now.
And the scale of attacks.
Kyiv reportedly faced a record drone attack involving 273 drones. Plus, there's this new Juran-3 drone Russia is supposedly using.
What's new about it?
It apparently has a nearly doubled warhead payload up to 90 kilograms. That's a lot more destructive potential.
And this is impacting Ukrainian logistics.
Yes, Ukrainian sources are apparently noting serious problems moving along the Kreminna-Kramatorsk highway. That's about 40 kilometers behind the front lines. But Russian drones are making movement there very difficult.
What about the diplomatic track, apart from the potential Trump-Putin call?
Well, U.S. Secretary of State Rubio warned that Congress might push through a new Russia sanctions bill if there's no progress on negotiations. Ukraine, understandably, is said to be anxiously awaiting that potential phone call.
Any more concrete plans for talks?
There are whispers, reports of preparations for a possible summit between Trump and Putin. Maybe October 2025, possibly in Malaysia, but some reports say it could be sooner. And Russia is apparently drafting a document outlining its ceasefire demands.
Okay, shifting regions slightly, something happened in the Baltic Sea.
Yes, a pretty concerning incident in Estonia's economic waters. It involved a vessel called the Jaguar, identified as part of the Russian Shadow Fleet.
Shadow Fleet, meaning?
Operating without a flag, no insurance. Standard practice for these vessels trying to evade sanctions, often carrying oil. Estonia went to guide it towards their territorial waters for inspection.
And Russia's reaction?
This is the critical part. Russia sent a fighter jet to, quote, check the situation. And that jet violated NATO airspace, Estonia's airspace, for close to a full minute.
A NATO airspace violation. That's serious.
Extremely serious. A definite escalation in a very sensitive area.
All right, let's turn to Gaza. The situation there sounds increasingly desperate.
It truly does. The IDF is describing its current ground operations as extensive. It's part of something they're calling Operation Gideon's Chariots.
And the goal?
Indications point towards a potential long-term occupation. The stated immediate aim is a 3-month full conquest of the remaining areas not under Israeli control. They reportedly control about 30% of Gaza now.
Objectives still routing Hamas and hostage release.
Yes, routing Hamas and securing the release of the 58 remaining hostages. There were also some reports of a possible rescue attempt in Khan Yunis recently.
But the humanitarian situation
Is catastrophic. According to reports, essentially no humanitarian aid or food has entered Gaza since March 2nd.
Which second? That's over 2 months.
Exactly. And the warnings about severe famine and starvation are becoming increasingly dire.
Is anything being done? Is Israel allowing aid now?
Israel has stated they will admit enough food soon to bridge the gap, supposedly until an internationally backed distribution system involving American companies is up and running within about a week.
But will that be enough?
The UN is already warning that Israel's distribution plan might fall short of the immense need on the ground. It's an incredibly worrying situation.
Okay, let's move to the U.S. southern border. Things seem to be changing there, too.
Yes, there seems to be a shift, with reports describing a perceived lockdown at the land border making crossings harder. There's been an increase in smugglers using the sea route.
So more maritime interdictions.
Exactly. The U.S. Navy and Coast Guard have boosted their presence, and there have been 350 reported incidents where they shot out the engines of smuggling vessels that refused to stop. Importantly, reports state 0 injuries from these actions.
And technology is playing a role.
Increasingly so. The Navy just expanded a contract, $4.6 million, with a company called Terradynamics. They're developing a fleet of XP-4 unmanned drones specifically for transporting equipment and supplies in that maritime environment.
Meanwhile, the situation in Mexico itself remains a huge concern, doesn't it, the cartels?
Very much so. The head of the DEA, Terran Cole, recently stated his belief that the majority of Mexico is essentially governed by cartels.
A majority. That's a stunning claim.
It is. He alleges deep infiltration of the Mexican government, hindering any real efforts to stop them. And Mexico, as you know, refuses any U.S. military operations on its soil.
And there were documents found.
Disturbing reports, yeah. Documents allegedly showing Mexico might even be facilitating the movement of migrants and smugglers towards the U.S. border.
So even with fewer land crossings reported due to U.S. security, the cartels are still powerful.
Absolutely. They still dominate border regions, especially places like Juarez. They found 281 cartel stash houses there just last year. So the shift to sea routes is a direct consequence of the tighter land border, but the underlying cartel power remains.
Seems like cooperation would be key, but that's not happening.
Chief Anilla was quoted saying partnership could be beneficial against the cartels, but acknowledged Mexico's president won't allow U.S. troops. Mexico does have about 10,000 National Guard troops on its northern border, but the effectiveness against entrenched cartels is, well, questionable, according to these reports.
Any other indicators of cartel control?
Interestingly, yes. Reports mention the discovery of cartel-linked religious artifacts near the border, suggesting their pervasive influence and control in the area.
Okay, one last item, and this is quite alarming, an incident in California.
Yes, this comes via reports associated with S2 Underground, a bombing at an IVF clinic. The American Reproductive Centers Clinic in Palm Springs, California, an IED detonated there.
What kind of device?
It was apparently a vehicle-borne IED, a VBIED, parked at the rear of the building.
Damage. Casualties.
Reports say severe damage to the clinic. Tragically, at least one fatality has been reported and several others were wounded.
And do they know anything about the bomb itself? Or the motive?
Initial assessments suggest it was a substantial and properly constructed IED, so not a simple pipe bomb, something more sophisticated. As for the motive, completely unknown at this point. Authorities are investigating.
Okay, that's a lot to cover. So just to recap the main points for you, we've seen COVID rates jump in China and especially Hong Kong, a mixed economic picture there, but also drop in emissions due to clean energy.
Right. Then major reported Russian advances in Ukraine amid intense drone warfare and ceasefire discussions, a NATO airspace violation in the Baltics, and a truly dire humanitarian crisis unfolding in Gaza.
Plus, a shift to sea smuggling at the U.S. border with deep concerns over cartel influence in Mexico. And finally, that disturbing bombing at a clinic in California.
It's certainly a complex global picture right now, with interconnected events unfolding rapidly.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the news. If you found this analysis valuable, please do consider liking and subscribing so you don't miss future updates.
We appreciate you tuning in as we continue to track these important global developments together.